Kingdom of Saba, or as you might know it, Sheba. This was an ancient kingdom in what's now modern-day Yemen, thriving between the 8th century BCE and around 275 CE, when it was eventually conquered by their neighbors, the Himyarites. Now some scholars think Saba might have existed even earlier, maybe as far back as 1200 BCE, but most agree it came to an end by around 275 CE. Now, Saba is probably most famous for the legendary Queen of Sheba, right? You've probably heard the story from the Bible where she visits King Solomon in Jerusalem. It's in the book of Kings and Chronicles. But did you know the story is also told in other places, like the Quran and the Ethiopian Kebra Negist? There are some pretty big differences in these versions though. The Kebra Negist even claims Sheba was in Ethiopia, not Arabia. Plus, she's mentioned in the New Testament too, both in Matthew and Luke. But back in its heyday, Saba wasn't just about legendary queens, it was actually a wealthy kingdom, and it made its fortune through trade. Saba controlled the incense routes, which stretched from southern Arabia all the way to the Mediterranean port of Gaza. This trade made them rich and powerful, and that's a big reason why the stories about their wealth and success spread far and wide. Before the 8th century BCE, another group, the Minians from the Kingdom of Maine, controlled the trade routes. But by around 950 BCE, Saba had taken over, taxing goods coming in from their southern neighbors like Hadramaut, Qataban, and the port city of Kani. But their dominance didn't last forever. Their trade took a hit during the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt when sea routes became more popular, and eventually they were overtaken by the Himyarites. Now, back to that famous Queen of Sheba. According to the biblical tale, she visited King Solomon, bringing him incredible gifts, including 120 talents of gold. That's like $3.6 million in today's money. These kinds of lavish gifts definitely match up with what we know about the wealth of Saba. But as for the queen herself, well, there's no real evidence outside of these stories that she actually existed. In some versions like the Targum Shani, an Aramaic text, her visit is way more exaggerated. Then the story was retold in the Quran, and later in the Ethiopian Kebra Negist, which even claims Solomon seduced the queen, and their son later took the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. So was the Queen of Sheba an Ethiopian ruler, or did she come from the Arabian Saba? That's a tough one to answer. If she did exist around 970 to 931 BCE, it's more likely she came from southern Arabia, which was gaining wealth and power at the time. The real key to Saba's success was the incense routes. These were the trade paths that connected southern Arabia to Gaza. They were incredibly profitable from the 8th or 7th century BCE until the 2nd century, and they stretched over 1,200 miles. Caravans would take about 65 days to travel these routes, stopping at cities along the way to rest, trade goods, and move on. The most valuable goods were frankincense and myrrh, produced in southern Arabia, but they also had access to other goods from India through the port of Kani. From there, the goods traveled north, eventually making their way to Gaza. The Nabateans were some of the most successful merchants on these routes. They even figured out how to control water supplies by digging wells and disguising them so only their caravans could use them. This clever tactic helped them travel faster and avoid the costs of stopping in cities to barter for water. At first, the Kingdom of Maine controlled most of the incense trade, but by around 950 BCE, Saba took over. By the 8th century BCE, they had solid control of the routes, and that's when Saba's influence and wealth really took off. And the Kingdom of Saba truly rose to power when they replaced the Minians as the dominant force in trade across southern Arabia. This shift in power made the Sabaeans the wealthiest kingdom in the region, with their goods being traded far and wide, from Mesopotamia to Egypt and the Levant, and even further beyond through the port at Gaza. By the time of Assyrian King Sargon II, around 722 to 705 BCE, Sabean trade was so extensive that they needed his permission to operate in Assyrian territory. And it wasn't just Assyria. Egypt had long been trading with the land of Punt in Nubia, and by this time they had also established a trade connection with Saba. This wealth of trade allowed Saba to grow into a powerful kingdom, and the Sabaean kings, known as Mukaribs, played a crucial role in building up their nation's infrastructure. One of the greatest achievements of the Sabaeans was the Marib Dam, considered the oldest known dam in the world. Built under the reign of Yahya Amar Wadai around 760 to 740 BCE, this dam was a marvel of engineering. It controlled the seasonal floods from the mountainous ravine and directed the water to farms in the valley below. The result? Abundant crops and a reputation as a green country, as even historians like Pliny the Elder described Saba. The dam turned Saba into a fertile and prosperous land, with enough crops to be harvested twice a year. The key to their success wasn't just agriculture though, it was their control over the highly profitable incense routes. Saba was famous for producing and exporting frankincense and myrrh, both highly valued aromatic resins. These exports made Saba incredibly wealthy, so much so that historians like Strabo even described the Sabaeans' homes as being adorned with gold, silver, and precious stones. Their prosperity, especially from the incense trade, helped make the Sabaeans one of the richest societies in the ancient world. Now, the Sabaean religion also played a significant role in their society. Much like the Mesopotamians, the Sabaeans believed that their gods had created the world and blessed them with all the good things in life. The Sabaean moon god, Almakah, was the most important deity and was comparable to the Mesopotamian moon god, Nana. The famous temple of Marib Bilqis, near Marib, was dedicated to Almakah and was revered long after the Sabaean kingdom fell. Alongside Almakah was Shamsh, the sun goddess, who shared traits with the Mesopotamian sun god Utu Shamash. While not much is known about the rest of their pantheon, it seems their gods mirrored those of neighboring cultures, with each deity overseeing different aspects of life. Temples were built both inside cities for the citizens and outside for the merchants and nomads. It's believed the king also served as a high priest, overseeing religious festivals and temple activities. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of detailed records about their religion or culture, since most of the surviving inscriptions are temple dedications and royal decrees. While other cultures like Egypt and Assyria left behind elaborate scenes and reliefs, the Sabaeans mainly focused on monumental texts. And now let's talk about how military conquests and diplomacy shaped the kingdom. The Sabaean rulers, after Yahya Amar Wadai, saw 31 different leaders come to power, but one of the most significant figures among them was Karibil Watar, who ruled in the 78/6th century BCE. He was the first to adopt the title Malik, meaning king, moving away from the previous title of Makarib. Karibil Watar became notorious for his military exploits, earning the nickname, "He Who Destroys Buildings," due to his campaigns against the Kingdom of Azin. In one brutal move, he decimated the nomadic tribes and established firm borders for Saba, all while claiming he was following the will of the god Almakah. His religious role and military victories made him incredibly powerful and wealthy. His conquest also brought in massive tributes, particularly from the Menians, further enriching Saba's great temple. Under his reign, Saba's wealth skyrocketed, especially because caravans traveling from southern regions like Kataban and Hadramaut had to pass through Saba. They were taxed heavily, and some merchants were so frustrated by these steep taxes that they left complaints which have survived to this day. But despite its peak prosperity, Saba couldn't avoid decline forever. The fall began when Egypt, during the Ptolemaic era, started using water routes instead of relying on land-based ones. Egypt had been trading across the Nile and the Red Sea for centuries, but now, instead of relying on Saba as a middleman, they began bypassing the kingdom. Egypt could now trade directly with cities like Kani, located along the Arabian coast, cutting Saba out of the lucrative incense trade. Saba's economy began to falter, but it was military conquest that truly brought the kingdom to an end. Around 200 CE, the Himyarites, a powerful tribe from Radin, began conquering neighboring kingdoms. After consolidating their power, they turned their attention to Saba, which fell by 275 CE. The Himyarites continued their conquests, taking Hadramaut by 300 CE, and eventually their kings declared themselves kings of Saba and Raden. They also rejected Saba's polytheistic traditions and embraced Judaism, leading to periods of religious persecution, particularly against Christians. Later, in 525 CE, the Christian kingdom of Aksum from Africa invaded and conquered the Himyarites, establishing Christianity in the region. Then, around 575 CE, the famous Marib Dam, which had been the lifeblood of Saba's agricultural success, collapsed. The Quran suggests this flood was divine punishment for Saba's refusal to acknowledge God's gifts, but a more practical explanation could be the dam's age and lack of maintenance. Some legends even claim rats gnawed at the dam's supports, causing it to weaken. By the time the dam failed, the kingdom of Saba was already gone, but the flood ensured that any hope of revival or future history was swept away. The Arab conquests of the 7th century and the spread of Islam further obscured Sabaean history, which only started drawing serious attention from scholars in the 19th century. At its height, Saba was a powerful and prosperous kingdom, once blessed by the gods, but over time it faced the same fate as many ancient civilizations.